Thank you everyone for coming. Today we are having Wenxin Du from Harvard Business School to present her work. Wenxin is a professor of finance at Harvard Business School and research associate at MBER as CEPR and associate editor at JFE, JIE, and RFS. Wenxin is very instrumental in the last decades or so in research. I think I've read almost every single paper by Wenxin, from local currency sovereign risk, deviation of covered interest parity, to a more work on U.S. banking sector liquidity management, and so Wenxin, we usually have around an hour of presentation. And Haolan has kindly agreed to discuss this paper. And so Haolan will have another roughly 5 minutes of discussion. I would say we are actually quite engaging most of the time. So Haolan has only 5 minutes. I think Haolan will interrupt and ask questions in between, and also maybe we will stay behind for some questions. Okay. So Wenxin, the floor is yours, and please.
Great. Thanks so much, Steve, for the wonderful introduction. Thank you so much, everybody, for coming, especially for those in the US coming right after Thanksgiving on a Black Friday. I hope we'll have a great discussion here. Please feel free to ask questions even during my presentation, and especially if you have clarifying questions. This is joint work with Kristen Forbes at MIT and also Matt Luzetti, who is the chief US economist at the Deutsche Bank. And we're going to be talking about quantitative tightening today. And this is, to our knowledge, the first work to put some empirical evidence together. So the key question is this very natural and obvious one: what are the effects of QT? If you ask this question to Chairman Powell before the start of the post-pandemic QT, and this is his answer, he said, "I would stress how uncertain the effect is of shrinking the balance sheet. I really can't be of any clearer. There won't be any clearer estimates." I think he's still right. We still to today, after writing this paper, haven't really nailed down the exact effects. But the hope is, after doing this work, at least we'll have some estimates on the likely effects so far to date. Okay, so what are the natural hypotheses? If we think about QT and going back to other Fed speakers, especially to Janet Yellen, during the QT1 experience in the US, which was between 2017 and 2019, she used this expression, QT is like watching the pen dry. In other words, it's a mechanical process of normalizing the central bank balance sheet. There shouldn't be any significant effects. However, if you think about the mechanics of QT in terms of quantity and activity, it's really the reverse of QE. We have large effects of QE so far, and another natural hypothesis is QT could just be in terms of reverse QE in terms of its effects. Okay, so we'll show you some evidence that our conclusion so far is QT has been having more muted effects, but qualitatively it is consistent with the QE in reverse hypothesis. All right. So what this paper does is we provide the first cross-country assessment of QT to date, where we analyze the post-pandemic QT in 7 advanced economies, in addition to the US QT1 experience between 2017 to 2019. The key conclusions, as I just mentioned, is QT has been largely working as intended. All these advanced economies so far have still been primarily using the policy interest rates as the key lever for adjusting the stance on monetary policy, and QT has only played a more minor role in supporting central banks' efforts to tighten financial conditions, and the overall impacts of QT has been less than QE in reverse in terms of the full effects, but qualitatively is pointing to the tightening of the overall conditions. And we're going to discuss some different results on different approaches across different central banks. We hope these lessons will be helpful for us thinking about QT strategies in the future. And a big caveat is the research so far has been looking at the experience so far to date, and it's possible that we'll be transitioning into the next stage of QT, where these effects might be becoming larger, and it's possible that we can quickly shift from a watching pen dry to watch a water boiling situation. All right, so the 4 key questions we are addressing in this paper and also in today's talk are as follows. First, we want to discuss very broadly what are the central bank strategies for QT to date, and then we'll talk about the effects of QT announcements. The third part will be discussing the effects of the implementing QT. And finally, we'll discuss this very important question for the functioning of the government bond market, which is who steps in, which sectors step in when the central banks unwind their holdings of government securities, and what are the implications for the functioning and the financial stability considerations of the government bond markets. Okay, so what are the central bank strategies for QT to date? This is a picture that we have summarized in terms of the timeline of QT across these 7 advanced economies. What you see is that according to the central bank playbook, this is this unofficial rule of thumb that seems to have been followed closely by central bankers, to shift from a very accommodative QE regime into a more tighter QT regime, the first thing that the central bank should do is to end QE, so end asset purchases, as shown in these blue crosses here. And if conditions requires further tightening, the central bank, after ending the large-scale asset purchases, might decide to raise the short-term interest rates. That's the lift-off green box here. And if conditions continues to demand further tightening, the central banks might begin QT. And QT takes 2 forms. The passive QT refers to just passive rollout of the existing security holdings. So central banks are not going to repurchase the securities that are matured. So just let the security run off, these maturing ones. Whereas the second type of QT refers to the active QT, where the central bank actually goes into either the secondary markets or have some special arrangements with Department of Treasuries to actually sell back securities to the market or back to the Treasury. Okay, so what we see here is all these post-pandemic QTs around 7 economies have followed a very compressed schedule compared to the QT1 experience in the US. So in the US during QT1, we see there was almost like a 2 or 3 year gap between the end of QE and the start of QT, whereas all the other countries following the pandemic have much more compressed schedule. QT and QE and the start of QT happened relatively soon, one after each other. And among 7 countries, it is important to note that 3 out of the 7 countries have adopted active QT so far. And those are New Zealand, Sweden, and UK. And all the other countries have been following just passive QT. And there are strategies that are different across country. One key contribution, which we think of the paper, is actually the appendix 2 of the paper, where we give a very detailed timeline of all the QT news and activities. And we hope this will be useful for researchers. So it's not a black box. You can actually look into what are the announcements that we cover in the paper. And in terms of the communication strategies, countries have different styles. Some countries have very lengthy communications, such as in the case of US. So when the QT news was actually announced, it wasn't so much of a news because the Fed speakers had been discussing QT for a while before making the formal major announcements. Whereas some other countries, QT came in a little bit of a short notice, so it came in more as a surprise. And another interesting case is UK actually had QT that's based on the policy rate. So I think they began the passive QT when the short rates reached a certain threshold, which was, I think, 25 basis points. And when the short rates reached another threshold, they began active QT. And countries, as we discussed, also have different transaction strategies. Passive QT refers to the role of existing securities. Some countries impose caps and limits. Other countries allow for full rollout. And active QT involves the active bond sales. And among these three countries, New Zealand is the one that has special arrangements with the Treasury and actually sold the bonds back to the Treasury instead of directly back into the secondary market. And that reflecting their concern of distorting prices in the secondary market, given the overall market for the government bond isn't that deep. And finally, in terms of securities involved in QT, all countries decide to basically involve government security for obvious reasons. And the countries that also had a broader QE program also include corporate bonds, agency MBS, and state and local bonds for their QT program. These two charts are
Wenxin, I have a question.
please.
I think in the post-pandemic period,
Yeah.
there are a lot of QE in some more emerging countries as well, right? Do you want me to think about all these results should be, extrapolating to emerging countries, or emerging countries is pretty different?
Good questions. So I haven't really looked into those. I think it would be very interesting to take a look. So my experience, impression, looking at the pandemic difference between advanced versus emerging market, it seems like advanced economy had like a larger scale in terms of government and also central bank interventions, likely due to more fiscal space, like more inflation credibility and all these reasons. And the overall scope from a direct official sector intervention in the emerging markets is more limited. But I do think you're right. There are countries that did like a QE in emerging markets as well. And as we'll go through some of the results, I suspect some of the, say, announcement-like results are likely to be similar. But in terms of the effects on the government bond markets and on the other aspects, I think it's likely to be more country-specific and policy-specific. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you.
Okay, so the paper, the working paper was prepared for a policy meeting back in March this year. So most of the results in the paper were updated throughout March this year, which isn't super up to date. So to prepare the seminar, I basically took two charts from Reserve Bank Australia, which actually maintains these very nice chart packs to document the progress of QT to date. So as we can see, all the 7 major economies, as we have in our sample, have made significant progress in shrinking the total size of their balance sheets and also in shrinking their footprint in the government bond market. The only exception, as you can see here, is Japan in advanced economy, which hasn't started QT yet. So Japan still has more than 50% of their government bond market held by the central banks, whereas for all the other central banks, their footprint in the government bond market has basically diminished significantly. Despite the fact that, for instance, the Federal Reserve still holds way more treasury securities in levels compared to what they had prior to the pandemic. If you look at as a share of the government bond outstanding, the level right now is about 20% of the US Treasury security held by the Fed, which is actually even slightly lower than the level at the beginning of 2016 in this chart. So, and similarly in many other major markets, in terms of the share of the share of government bonds held by central banks, we have normalized to the pre-pandemic level. And in terms of the progress measured in terms of reduction of total assets of the central banks as a percent of GDP, pretty much in all these countries, we've experienced like 10 to 20% reduction of central bank balance sheets measured in terms of GDP. So I would say that's a significant amount of progress to date. Okay. And so that's the first part where we talk about different strategies, and I gave you an overview of the progress made to date. The next part is to talk about the effects of QT announcements. So here we're going to be adopting a very standard event study methodology, where we're going to be looking at, say, a 2-day change in the government bond yield across different benchmarks accrued here on the left-hand side on the QT dummy. And this is the QT announcement dummy. Again, Appendix Table 2 gives you all the list of the QT announcements that are included in this study. So we're very transparent about it. It's important to note that on the QT announcement days, sometimes there are additional announcements coming from the central banks. There could also be additional data releases that's related to the macroeconomic news. So in addition to control for the QT announcement dummy, we also control for news, okay? We also control for, in addition to the changes, the surprises to the short-term interest rates, if there are additional announcement regarding the short-term interest rates on the same day, okay? And we can run robustness, excluding window market turmoil, such as in March 2020 or during the LDI crisis in the UK and the SVB crisis in the US in 2023. All the results include the country fixed effects. So I rely on the overall panel for identification. As you can see, we don't have that many announcements per country, so it's important to pull all these announcements together to have more powerful estimates. So what do we find?
Sorry, one quick question. Sorry, I didn't read the Appendix 2. Are these the first announcement or announcement over a few times for a particular QT?
There could be multiple announcements. Some of these are preliminary discussions. Some of them are actual official announcements, and some of the post-announcement comments. So anything that, to our knowledge, that are counted towards QT announcements are included, but obviously there could be a few.
I see. So this would be a dummy. I think this QT would be a dummy, right? A dummy that the announcement is made. I see.
Exactly. So it's not necessarily announcements. I use the word announcement effects because that's our typical lingo for this event study, but it should just be QT news. So anything that's related to the QT program, either in expectation or during the actual implementation counts.
I see. Yeah.
Wenxin, can I also follow up with a question? So do you have a sense like to what extent these QT events is sort of followed by like heightened market discussion about the central bank's potential steps towards quantitative tightening, in the sense that how much do you think that these QT events are expected by the markets in advance, or do you have a sense if there are like a super strong discussion about what the central bank is going to do, or the markets have entered into some sort of consensus in terms of the timetables and so on and so forth?
Yeah, so as we discussed briefly in the first part, the communication strategy differ quite a bit by country. So in the case of US, right, we had a lot of discussion, and so market had a very good expectation for what's coming, but that may not be the case in some other countries. We have a little subsection describing what counts as surprises. So I have prepared a couple of slides. We can go over that once we get there. All right. So that's the basic regression setup. I'll show you the baseline results first. The baseline result is, as you can see in the, I think show in the black bar here. So this is the average effects per announcements on the QT dummy, okay? And as you can see, it averaged to about 4 basis points, pretty uniform if you look at the average effects across tenors, except for the very short-dated bills, that there doesn't seem to be effects. But from 1 year to 30 year, we on average find about 4 basis points average effects. And if you split these news/announcements into 2 categories, most of the effects is driven by the main announcements, so larger announcements. And so those are showing in the red bars here, whereas the preliminary discussion, like such as all these preliminary things we discussed in the US, on average, we don't find a significant effects across the full sample. And so in terms of direction, if you look at the other financial metrics, I Yeah, so I think, yeah, I'll show you the table later, but this is just on the government bond yields. So basically around 4 basis points average effects per announcement. And we also controlled, as you see, interest rate surprises on the same day, which obviously also show up pretty significant if QT announcements are accompanied by also interest rate announcements. That would also affect the government bond yields. And if there is additional incoming economic data that are more positive than expected, that also increase the government bond yields. So controlling for the short rate surprises and controlling for new economic data, we still have about 4 basis point additional effects coming from the QT announcement dates. And if you look at the other financial metrics, so here we're just running different left-hand side variables, we don't really find much. So unlike QE, if you remember, the literature has found very large effects in terms of loosening financial market overall condition in addition to reducing government bond yields. In the context of QT, so far we haven't really been finding much on the other financial indicators, except there seems to be some effects on the corporate bond markets. So we do find very small, like 20 basis points reduction in the corporate, actually this could be, yeah, I think it's 20 basis point reduction in the corporate bond index. So return are lower, the yields are higher slightly. For all the other variables, even including equity markets, we don't really find much of effects. This variable has 3 stars. This is what we measure as the government bond convenience yield using the difference between the interest rate swap and the government bond at 10-year maturity. So the higher the spread is, what we think is the more convenient the government bond is. Because in most countries, except for in the US and UK, the interest rate swap rates are higher than the government bond yields, which are natural because you expect the government bonds to have better pledgeability, have better collateral value, have better liquidity in many markets, whereas interest rate swap rates are bank rates. So it's normal, it's natural for bank rates to trade above the government bond yields. And the higher the gap, the more convenient the government bonds are. So what we find is that the QT has been associated with deterioration or a narrowing of the convenience yield measure measured by swap spread. And in the context of US and UK, when the swap spreads are negative to begin with, QT just make it more negative. And
sorry, Wenxin, a quick question on the magnitude. How do you interpret the coefficient for the convenience yield?
The convenience yield, I think I have to, I don't remember the exact.
0.02 is
Yeah,
2.
Right. I think in the paper, we have a bit of a discussion also to controlling for the supply of government bonds. Yeah, so that's more on the implementation side. So here, I think it's measured still in this one in percent. So there'll be 2 basis points on average, 2 basis points reduction in the convenience yield. So yeah, not super big, but it came in significant with 3 stars. And in the implementation section, we have a bit of discussion on the progress so far and how much has that contributed to deterioration of convenience yield. In those regressions, we also control for the supply of government bond, which is another factor to make something less convenient. If you supply more of that, and given the pandemic QE, during the pandemic QE, and also in the aftermath, all the countries around the world have also boosted the supply of government bonds. So that's also another factor that has made the convenience yield to fall. But those supply things shouldn't affect too much at this high frequency level.
Yeah, do you have a little bit more thought on the mechanism why QT will reduce the convenience yield? Because I was expecting QT reduce the supply of government bonds. Oh, actually, sorry, never mind. It's the opposite. Yeah.
Exactly. That's right, because QT increases the supply available to the markets, right? So that's equivalent, not equivalent, but it's similar to increase the supply. And if you have a lot of this convenient thing, that's going to become less convenient. That's the intuition. Okay, so that's that. So we also show you this figure cross-country in terms of the effects, with the big caveat that we don't have a lot of power for this exercise because we only have a few announcements per country. So as you can see, the solid bars indicate the estimates that are statistically significant at 10% level. So we don't have a lot of significance, but showing you the points estimates, you see a bit of cross-country heterogeneity, and in particular, in the countries that are running active QT, like New Zealand, UK, and Sweden, you seem to see a bit more effects, but Australia is also a country with quite high point estimates, and US, the point estimates is close to 0. So on average, this is the average effects per announcement within each country where you see some heterogeneity. Okay. And we also split the sample into the active QE adopters versus the passive QT adopters versus the passive QT adopters. And pretty interestingly, where you see that among the active QT adopters, you see more of effects on the slope of the yield curve. So the blue lines are getting bigger, maybe with some exception of 30 years. So overall getting bigger across the maturity as we increase the tenor. Whereas the passive QT seems to be more uniform or even diminishing at the longer end. So our interpretation of this result is that passive QT could be primarily signaling stronger commitment to tighter policy among the central bank, whereas the active QT, given the central bank holdings are more concentrated around the long end, so active QT could actually have more material effects in steepening the slope of the yield curve. Okay. And so coming back to Haonan's question about identify surprises. So we did a couple of things. So this project was done also in preparation for a big policy meeting. So among the committee that I was involved, we have some private sector participants. So what we did is to ask them. So in the end, the 3 banks agreed to do this. Actually, 4 financial institutions agreed to this exercise for us. Is we asked analysts at Deutsche Bank, JP Morgan, Morgan Stanley, and Vanguard to review their investment bank style reports prior to these announcements and compare to what they wrote versus what was actually announced, and label whether the announcement was a surprise. Okay, so the problem with this approach is the results that we got back from analysts are largely showing they were not surprised. So they tried to justify that they did a good job predicting what's coming next. So there are actually not that many surprises based on this more narrative approach. By asking the analyst. But of course, alternative way is to actually, for like a more objective third party, to review all their writings and to label them the third party themselves. But we haven't gone that route yet. So far, if you just ask an analyst to compare what they wrote versus what came actually afterwards, they didn't really indicate that many surprises, but there were a few. Okay, and the other approach we did is for countries that actually release information on the market expectation for the balance sheet policy. This one, we can do it more objectively, where we can compare the announcements with the market expectation before the announcement. And this can only be done for the Fed and the ECB, and a few sub-states for the Bank of England. Not every single country has published or has conducted survey around the market expectations for the central bank balance sheet policy. So after doing these 2 exercises, we're able to identify only 7 out of the 48 events as more of a surprise. And so what we did is we run our entire sample only on these 7 surprise states. And what we find is actually just slightly larger point estimates. So the previous average estimates was 4 basis points per announcement, but if you zoom in at these surprise events, you get about 6 to 8 basis points per announcement. But if you run it in the full sample with interaction for the between the announcement and the surprise announcement, the coefficient on the interaction isn't significant because we only have 7 events that are labeled as surprise. So there is some evidence, at least qualitatively, that pointing to that the surprise announcements seem to have a little larger impacts, but the statistically is not significant and the overall magnitude isn't very big. Okay, so far I've been talking about the effects per announcement. But as we discussed, there are a few countries with many announcements. So an alternative way to think about the overall effects is actually to sum up all these announcement effects within each country and to look at the cumulative effects. So if you do so in countries with a lot of announcements, and especially with more notable average announcement effects, you're going to end up with a much larger or more notable overall effects. And that's what we have, for instance, for the UK. So UK has quite a few announcements on average, have a notable average effects. So the total cumulative effects for the UK ranges between, say, 40 to 70 basis points, much more significant than the 4 basis point average effects. And similarly for Australia, we're talking about 30 basis points overall cumulative effects across different maturities. And if you cumulatively sum up all these announcement effects, even for the US, despite that the average effects was so minuscule or not significant, the cumulative effects, you can get that up to around 20 basis points for longer dated tenors. So this is to say the average announcement effect is small, but if you add up all the announcement, QT seems to have more of effects. But how does this effects compare to QE so far? So comparison of impact of QE and QT is hard to make because these are very different animals. QE and QT are implemented under very different economic conditions. QE was introduced and implemented during the crisis time, whereas QT was implemented during the more tranquil economic period when the policy tightening was needed. So it's very hard to compare these programs apple to apple. And also QE came in more as a fixed amount, more deterministic program, whereas QT is more open-ended. But we're still going to go ahead and look at some of the QE estimates and talk about how do they compare with QT so far. So if you look at the QE estimates in the literature, QE1, I think the literature has reached a consensus. There's very large effects. So if you look at the announcement style event study, QE1s are associated generally with over 100 basis point effects on the government bond yields. Whereas QE2 and QE3 came in with much more muted effects. Okay, so compare the effects of QT with QE1. I think it's fair to say the effects of QT is much more muted, so much less than QE1 in reverse. But if you compare the effects of QT with QE2 or QE3, so QE2 and QE3 were introduced during like slightly more calm period, and then the effects of QT has been more comparable so far to date with QE1, QE2, and QE3. I think that's our conclusion. Okay, so much more muted effects than QE launched during stress, but more comparable compared to QE launched more during more calm period. All right, so that concludes the announcement effects discussion. Now let's talk about the implementation effects. Implementation effects are very hard to identify, and we didn't really do a terrific job. I'm just going to show you the exercise that we did, and I think definitely more work can be done on this part to be more specific about what are the overall effects to date. So what we did so far is, for the most part, we also adopted announcement style or event study approach to looking at the high frequency effects around QT implementation instead of taking a more cumulative view. It's harder to do a cumulative view because QT was entirely coinciding with the overall tightening in monetary policy stance. There's been large increases in the short rates across all countries, and central bank communications overall became more hawkish to fight inflation around the world. So it's really hard to disentangle the overall cumulative effects of QT away from this overall tightening in the monetary policy stance. But what we did is we look at around the QT implementation dates and look at the government bond yield and other financial market indicator dynamics around those narrowly defined implementation dates. Okay, so that's the first thing we did. So how do we define these implementation dates? So the implementation dates are defined both for active QT adopters and also for passive QT adopters. For the active ones, it's easy, just the dates that the central banks are actually conducted sales of their government bonds, existing holdings. So those are the implementation dates among the active adopters. And among the passive adopters, we look at the dates that the central bank are not rolling over its existing holdings when a security matures on its balance sheets. And in many countries, that generally coincide with the auction dates of the new batch of security auctions. So basically, those are the days that the central banks are not participating in the primary markets because they decide to just let the security mature. Okay, so what do we find? I can show you the table later, but overall, we don't find any significant differences between the government bond dynamics on these QT implementation dates versus the non-QT implementation dates. So it's a non-result result. And among the countries that are adopting active QT, we can also do additional exercise, which is to compare the government securities that are sold by central bank versus the securities that are not sold by central bank. So this is looking at the bond level exercise. And again, it's a non-result result. We don't find difference, which suggests so far to date, we have not found significant evidence in terms of the direct distortion that the central banks are causing in the pricing of the government bonds around these implementation dates. Okay, I can show you these tables. So here, all the units are already in basis points. And if you look at the dummies, they're all less than 1. So not only none of them are statistically significant, the point estimates are also generally less than like half a basis point. So we really don't find anything in terms of the yield dynamics between, there's no difference between the QT implementation dates versus the non-QT implementation dates. And if you look at the 3 countries that are doing active QT by comparing the difference between the QT securities, the ones that are sold by central bank versus the ones that are not touched by central banks, again, like all the point estimates are less than half a basis point. There's only 1 marginal star for New Zealand if you measure it in terms of the spread over the interest rate swap. So overall, there isn't really any evidence suggesting different dynamics among the securities that are touched by central banks. Okay, so that's the part on government yields and on government bond yields. We also did similar things for financial market indicators. Still didn't really find much around these high frequency announcement style event studies. But again, as we discussed, the caveat is having the non-results around the implementation doesn't necessarily mean the absence of the overall cumulative effects. It's very possible that the rise in the long yield still has a part attributable to QT. It's not really captured by this event study style exercise. So going beyond the government bond yields and the equity bond market and FX dynamics, we also want to have a bit of a discussion about the impacts of QT on money market and on the bank liquidity balance, because I think here we see more notable effects. So I'll first show you a slide on the quantity. So what this slide showing is the reduction in the central bank total assets and a few major assets and liability items on the central bank balance sheets between the start of QT and I think the end of 2023 when we were writing this working paper. So what you see is that in all countries, all central banks until 2023 already had large progress in reducing the size of their overall balance sheet. That's showing this red bar. So the big reduction in the central bank assets, around 5 to 10% of GDP, is generally followed by a large reduction in their security holdings. That's the yellow bar. So that's the QT, right? QT took in the form of reduction in the security holdings of central banks, which generally translate into the overall reduction in the central bank total assets. So these are the 2 things that we discuss on the asset side of the central banks. So central bank has a balance sheet just like a regular bank. There is also a liability side of the central bank balance sheet that has to match up with this reduction on the asset side. So what are the items that are most relevant on the liability side of the central bank balance sheet that are part of the QT implementation? in most countries, we have this light blue area. The light blue bars reflecting the reduction in the bank liquidity balance, or in the US, we call them bank reserves on the central bank balance sheet. So basically, the process of QE is central banks creating these digital checking account balance called bank reserves and deposit in these banks' checking account at Fed, which are the reserve accounts, and those are used to finance the QE. And during the QT, the reverse happens. The central banks don't need to hold this much of securities and therefore don't need this much of financing coming from the digital reserves from their respective banking sector. And as a result, banking sector reserve generally declines. There is a notable exception here, which is the US QT2 experience, where you can see, unlike the QT1 experience, most of the reduction in central bank assets is being supported by the reduction in the bank reserves. During QT2, we have this additional item that was more important, far more important. And this additional item refers to the reduction in the overnight reverse repo balance at the Fed. And if you like, you can think about this as non-banking sector's liquidity balance parked at the Fed. So one unique feature of the US is that the Fed allows non-banks, largely money market funds, to also park their extra liquidity or extra cash at the Fed through the form of reverse repo. So money market funds lend to the Fed overnight against Treasury securities, and Fed pays them an interest on this overnight reverse repo balance. And what we have seen so far is that during the process of QT, the non-banks, these money market funds, have significantly reduced their balance at the Fed. And as a result, the banking sector to date has not suffered a large reduction in reserve yet. Okay, so this can be seen more clearly by looking at an up-to-date chart downloaded from Fred a couple of weeks ago. So the as you can see, the blue line refers to the overnight reverse repo balance, and the red line refers to the bank reserves. So what we have seen here is that the current QT is entirely supported by a large reduction in the blue line, whereas the bank reserve has been pretty stable throughout QT overall. It's very different from the QT1 experience in the US. If you look at the 2017 to 2018, gradually we've seen a large reduction in reserves, and the overnight reverse repo balance was very close to zero during QT1. So this chart also illustrates a very important point, is that so far to date, the banking sector has not lost that much reserve. But going forward, given that the overnight RRP facility has been nearly depleted, so we could be entering into a new stage of QT where the banking sector would have to reduce their reserve balances. And if you recall, back in September 2019, after QT1, the banking sector, if you look at this chart, had about $1.4 trillion reserve back in September 2019, which was a lot higher than what they had before the global financial crisis in 2008. But 1.4 back in September 2019 was not sufficient for the well-functioning of the short-term funding markets. And we had a repo crisis where the repo rate hit 10%. So once we enter into this next stage of QT, when the banking sectors are begin to reduce their reserve balances, it would be very interesting and important to monitor the overall funding condition, okay, in the short-term funding markets. And even if before going there, if you look across countries, because many countries have already reduced their banking sector liquidity and banking sector reserves, and that shows up pretty clearly in the overnight money market spreads in those countries. So G, you have a question. Why don't you go ahead?
Yeah, could you go back to the earlier slide on the reduction in the balance sheet?
Yes, this one.
This one, yeah. So I was wondering, have you looked at the total size of demandable deposit? And I was asking because Viral and Raghu made a point that during QE, the banking sector whole balance sheet increased, while during QT, the total balance sheet of the banking sector does not shrink, as they simply swap the reserve with the treasury. And so there's a symmetric effect between the QT and QE. And I think they showed that for the US during the first QT1, the total size of the balance sheet measured as the demand deposit does not go down. So I was wondering, is this pattern first, is it universal between QT1 and QT2, or is it universal to other countries, or is it a very US specific phenomenon?
Yeah, so in terms of the central bank balance sheet, this big dynamics in the overnight reverse repo, that's quite unique to the US. None of the other central banks had large balances by non-banks parked at the central bank. So what you mentioned is more thinking from the commercial bank balance sheet as opposed to central bank balance sheets. And in that consideration, the reserves of the banks become the assets of the commercial banks, right? The reserves are liability of the central banks, but are the assets of the commercial banks, and the liability of commercial banks are these demandable deposits, right, or types of borrowing that are on the liabilities. And in addition, the treasury securities could also be on the asset side on the bank balance sheet.
Exactly, yeah.
So going forward, so again, the banking sector hasn't been stress tested yet for QT2, given the reserve hasn't really changed much. But for QT1, I think, yeah, what Rael and Raghu was showing must be, I mean, just the correct fact, right? It's very possible that the banking sector ended up holding more treasuries and to swap out reduction in reserves, and therefore the overall asset side hasn't changed much. And given the vast majority of the commercial bank liability takes the form of deposits, so therefore deposits haven't changed that much.
Yeah.
That could well be the case. Going forward, it will be a little tricky given the whole spring banking crisis in 2023. I think it's a little uncertain how steady the demand will be for treasury securities coming from commercial banks. So I think it's a little hard to say, but yeah, it also depends on the pace of QT and scale going forward. And we also know that all the banks, large ones, have to fulfill the Basel III liquidity coverage ratio regulation, where they have to maintain a certain level of high quality liquid assets, and both treasuries and reserves count at level 1 HQLA. So if banks are already constrained by their LCR metric, if they lose reserves, they have to basically source more treasuries just by default in order to stay LCR compliant. So that could also be a factor that affects the overall development of the commercial bank balance sheet.
If that's the case, then we kind of expect that this will be more universal across all countries, that when they do the QT, the balance sheet wouldn't shrink because of the universal, the Basel regulation out there.
Yeah, among the large ones. I mean, depends on how much buffer they have, right? So if they have a lot of buffer, then they can decide to run down more. Otherwise, yes. Otherwise, but there's also an issue about the relative split between reserve and treasuries, even though they are counted the same under the Basel III LCR. However, if you look more around like liquidity supervision framework and also thinking about the intraday liquidity, reserves and treasury have very different properties. For intraday liquidity, reserves are much more liquid, right? They're just instant cash, whereas the treasuries need to be liquidated. So banks may also increase their demand for reserves if the overall supply of reserve shrinks. And yeah, so that may also be an issue coming up. Okay, so we talked about that. So going back to the slides on the pricing effects in the overnight short-term funding markets, we've already seen quite a bit of effects, especially outside US QT2. So what this bar chart showing is that we plot the average spread between the central bank deposit rate paid to the banks and the overnight private money market rates among the market participants. So we plotted this spread. This is what we call the short-term funding spreads. We plot the average level before the launch of QT. I think it's likely 3 or 6 months average average level before the launch of QT in green. And then we plotted the average spreads since the start of QT until the end of 2023. So what we see is that for every single country except for US QT2, the short-term funding spread has moved up, which means the private money market rates becomes higher relative to the central bank deposit rate, and higher private money market rates refers to a tighter short-term funding market condition. And again, US, it's not a surprise. US QT1 has experienced a large compression in the Fed funds over interest on reserve spread. And if you recall, in September 2019, the Fed funds actually printed above its target when the repo rate was hitting 10%. So the spread became quite positive, even though on average it's a negative spread. So far to date, I think even today, if you look at the Fed funds over the interest on reserve spread during US QT2 compared to the level before the start of QT2, that hasn't changed much. That's just another way to say the banking sector hasn't really lost too much reserve. There hasn't been an obvious liquidity problem among the banks yet, because most of the QT has been supported by the overnight RP facility reduction in the US. Okay. Even though the Fed funds hasn't showed much of a stress, if you look at some other segments of the money market, if you update this chart, I think you're likely to find even more of a noticeable effects in the repo market. So if you do the same chart as we show you in the Fed funds IOR, there hasn't been much change. If you do it using a repo index, the benchmark floating rate in the US is currently SOFR, which is secured overnight financing rate, which is the composite repo rate. So you've got repo rate that already moved up even by the end of last year. I think if you update it now, it's going to even moving up a little more. And in particular, if you look at the 75th percentile of the SOFR distribution, or if you look at the 99th percentile of the SOFR distribution, those tail end of the repo rates have moved up a lot more over the IOER relative in terms of the relative spread. So I think even within the US, we have seen some tightening of the short-term funding conditions, even though it hasn't been fully reflected in the Fed funds rate, which is more like these interbank rates, because the banks haven't reduced that much of reserve yet. Okay, so yes, so how are we doing on time? Actually, not super well, so I sort of lost track of time. Okay, so I'm gonna skip and just have a quick discussion about who steps in when the central bank unwind their holdings. And this part, we're just gonna run a regression of change in each sector's share in the government bond markets on the change in the Fed share. We also want to see if there's any significant difference between QE and QT. So we had a QT period that means interacting with the central bank shares. Very interestingly, if you look at the pooled regression using the IMF data, given they have a more standard breakdown of the holders of government bonds, it is the domestic non-bank that is the most important sector to step in when the central banks are unwinding their holdings of government securities. So who are these domestic non-banks? Using more detailed data from flow of funds style data, at least in the US, it is the household sector that are stepping in when the central banks are unwinding their holdings. And who are the household sectors in the US? This is the residual sector in the US flow of funds. So anything that is not captured in any other sector is going to be labeled households. This notably includes the hedge funds domiciled in the US and also domiciled in the rest of the world if these hedge funds are not covered in the survey done by the Treasury Department to compute their rest of the world flow of funds statistics. So therefore, there are actually quite a lot of hedge funds that are not covered in this TIC survey to calculate the US balance of payment and all these cross-border conditions, and they again fall back to the US household sector. So I think we have quite a bit of evidence suggesting that the hedge fund cash future basis trade is a big part of the QT clearing the market mechanism. So how does this trade work? The hedge fund sector, especially the relative value hedge funds, have this strategy where they go buy treasury bonds in the cash market, and then they hedge all the duration risk of these treasury by shorting the interest rate futures. So they collect the difference or the basis between the cash and futures for the treasuries. So what we see here is that they have built up a very large and negative positions in the treasury futures market. And if you believe this big negative build-up in the futures position corresponding to a very long position in the cash treasury, currently we have about $1 trillion of the cash future basis trade. This could be an overstatement, but if you look at the dynamics, this trade really gets built up during QT2 and also during QT1. And the unwinding of this basis trade was a big problem in March 2020 following QT1 because by unwinding this trade, the hedge fund sector had to sell treasuries, which could lead to fire sales. And what we had in March 2020 was a big meltdown in the long-term treasury markets. So I think I'll just pause here. I already ran out of time, and we basically discussed all these 4 aspects today.
Great, thank you. So Haonan will be the discussant, and so Haonan, if you can share your slides. I mean, Ziyu has a quick question. Oh, I
No,
think
I'm just
Yeah, I'm happy to stay over a little because I completely lost track of time. So for people who are interested in asking questions, don't worry about the deadline in 3 minutes. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Shall I start? Can you see my screen?
Yes, please.
Okay, great. Fantastic. Thank you so much for having me here. This is a fantastic paper. It's very timely because everybody's super interested in how QT is gonna move the market, and especially whether QT is gonna be fundamentally different or it's just basically the reverse of QE. So I think this paper provides very comprehensive answer across a large number of countries for a very important question. So in the interest of time, I'm not gonna just summarize over what has already been a very clear presentation by Wenxin. I'm just going to jump directly to 2 relatively complementary points that I have after reading the entirety of the paper. So the first thing is about the final section of the paper, which is on trying to understand who actually steps in to the market when the central banks actually sells treasuries or let the treasuries roll off, essentially reducing the size of the portfolio. So I understand that the paper is written in a more policy-oriented type of manner, and so some of the regressions here are meant to be as a relatively illustrative decomposition exercise. For instance, this particular regression tries to basically relate changes in investor shares on changes in central bank shares in the treasury market, which is a perfectly valid regression in terms of its interpretation when it comes to like decomposition. Basically, the idea is if the central bank sells $1, how much is going to be picked up by a particular investor. Potentially it's going to be 60 cents, it's going to be 30 cents, but overall, all the other investors are going to pick up the 100% of the central bank's selling. So this is a perfectly valid exercise. My minor point of caution is just to caution against using this as a more structural type of interpretation or making a causal statement related to this point. Essentially because of 2 things. The first thing is that if you believe that investors has a structural demand curve that looks like the follows. Delta Q, which is going to be the amount transacted or amount purchased, amount sold, is going to be a linear function of both the changes in central bank holdings of central bank shares and also the some other macro factors. Here I write it as XT, and then also because this is a demand curve, so this is also potentially related to the actual price of the securities, of the price of the market portfolio of treasuries. So if this is potentially a reasonable specification of this true demand curve, because a lot of these QT operations are sort of pre-announced in advance. So so market participants are potentially able to sort of anticipate some of the amount of the selling of the central banks over a reasonably short time horizon. So they're going to basically be able to structure their trade according to what the central bank is potentially going to do for the next quarter or so. So in that sense, including the central bank shares or central bank holding variables in the demand functions of these investors sounds relatively reasonable. But then the idea here is that because the first equation kind of omits the actual changes in the yields and also the macro factors, then the interpretation of the estimated beta 1 is going to be a little bit subtle because for one thing, there's going to be a subtle missing intercept problem here. Without including the changes in yield, because the market clearing the estimated beta is actually going to be able to capture something that is akin to a relative sensitivity. So it's still true that potentially domestic non-banks is still going to be most sensitive to central banks setting of the treasuries, but it's not. It's basically they're more sensitive relative to the market average. It's not necessary that they're absolutely more sensitive. This is not a big issue because this is more relevant when it comes to thinking about the sign of the sensitivities. But the second thing is that when it comes to other investors' inaction, it could be actually due to, for instance, failure to specify additional macro factors, as in the sense that the impact of the macro factors may somewhat offset the responsiveness, the pure responsiveness of these investors to pre-announced central bank paths of purchasing, or central bank's paths of selling. So these type of omitted variables here could potentially complicate a little bit the interpretation of the regression coefficients coming from the first equations. This is my first point. The second point is more of a complementary point here. This is drawing reference to a new paper that I have with Zhi, who's here, and also Manav Chaudhry at Chicago Booth. What basically do is to sort of take the missing intercept problem and also take the demand curve a little bit more from a structural point of view, from a demand system point of view, to construct a demand system, estimated demand system for U.S. Treasury bonds and notes, so that we can actually do a decomposition in terms of who actually moves Treasury yields from 2003 to 2023, so covering the QT2 and also QT1 episodes. And the QT2 episodes is essentially going to be covered here in the red rectangle here. And what you can see here is that our results is relatively broadly consistent with Wenxin's finding using high frequency type of analysis, in the sense that, broadly speaking, we find that QT, or the Fed's role in terms of driving the long-term Treasury yield, is relatively minimal during this period. In terms of the actual numbers, because we were sort of estimating a little bit like a cumulative quarterly effect on Treasury yields, it's going to be a bit higher compared to Wenxin's estimate. It's in terms of but when you take into account the fact that these other type of investors may well anticipate their impact, the Fed's pre-announced the selling path for the quantitative tightening episodes here, then the results could be bumped up a little bit more, but still the impact is quite small, especially compared to, for instance, the COVID episodes in which Feds are making basically a lot of purchases during these episodes, and also the QE2 and QE3 episodes in which you can also see the red bars here, which is going to represent the Fed's contribution to the compression of Treasury yields during this particular time window. So this is just to show that, broadly speaking, even when we use a very different methods, we sort of arrive at a very similar finding, in the sense that QT2 is relatively a benign thing, at least up until now. Another interesting observation here is also that this is also consistent with Wenxin's message in this paper, that instead of thinking about unconventional policy, in this particular episode, if you look at the right-hand side panel, most of the actions for the policies in terms of bumping up the Treasury yields are actually coming from this yellow bar, this Fed funds rate, these short-term conventional monetary policy part. So this is also perfectly consistent with the story that Wenxin was telling. So the idea is just to show that even when we use different approaches, we sort of arrive at different, very similar conclusion in terms of the provisional impact of QT2 at this point. I'm just going to end by basically asking, like throwing out a bunch of questions without really answering them. So the first, basically, these are some of the questions that interest me when I read the paper. The first thing is, we only have like 7 or 8 countries, but it's still interesting to sort of potentially have a sense about the heterogeneity across countries when it comes to thinking about the path through of QT to yields. What are some of the potential structural drivers driving the heterogeneities? Is it because of the depths of the financial systems are different, or some other sort of, or is it because of some policy, the approach of announcing the policies are different, so on and so forth. And the second bullet point is also quite interesting to me because the paper uses flow of funds data, and also a lot of the impact that has been identified in this paper comes from these announcement effects. So I was just wondering if we could sort of utilize some of the gaps between the announcement and the actual implementation to look at flow of funds during the quarter of announcement, but before the actual implementation, like some of the cases in Sweden and UK, where the quarter of announcement seems to be sort of these news seems to be potentially dominating the investors' trade on the policy side. So it might be interesting to look at what sectors are most responsive to these particular announcement of QTs. And I just want to end by saying that, as Wenxin mentioned during her presentation, it is quite tricky to compare QT and QE directly because the environments of QE and QT are quite different. So when we look at these results, this is something we might still want to keep in mind. I'm just going to end here. Thank you so much for giving me this opportunity. Thanks a lot.
Great. Wenxin, you want to have a quick reply?
Yeah, I just want to say thank you so much, Haonan, and you're absolutely right. I think your work with Zhiyu and yeah, co-author is like fantastic, and you're also bridging some of these missing parts because you actually use a demand-based system and to think about these effects, especially more cumulatively, carefully, and yeah, so I think it's quite nice, and we definitely need that piece of work to complement what I've been discussing here.
Great. I have 2 very quick questions. The first one is, do we know, like, I think you show us a picture, like, when in the US implementing QT, there are a lot of absorption from the hedge fund. Do we know what's going on when we are having QT? Like, for example, the post-COVID QT, QE, the post-COVID QE, are the hedge fund selling bonds to the Fed, or like I was thinking about, I think the original purpose of QE is actually taking a lot of treasury and free up the capacity of the banking sector. So I'm interested about that. And the second point is the cumulative effect of QT, right? Because I think QE and QT are conducted in a very, very different window. In QE, you want to dump a lot of liquidity in a very short period of time. I'm wondering about, if you have tried the cumulative effect of QT over the, I don't know, the implementation window, something like that. Yeah.
Right. Great. Good question. So yeah, on the hedge fund part, and what's their role during QE? So if you look at the average effects, right? So it's important to note that the overall supply of treasury is also changing in big times. And during the overall supply of treasury actually was greater than that's being bought by the Fed. So the rest of the market, non-Fed market, has to actually overall absorb more treasury in dollar amounts. But if we look at the actual share of each sector in this overall growing supply, on average, that you do find this U.S. household sector tend to, on average, behave negatively against the Fed share. So when the Fed is increasing its share during QE, on average, the household sector reduces the share. But during QT, that's where the interactive effects on the QT dummy and also the Fed share, that's also highly significant for the household sector. So they are more, because they're more responsive during QT than compared to during QE. But qualitatively, they seem to be on the opposite side of the central bank. That's that. And in terms of cumulative effects, so I showed you these cumulative effects of announcement. So those are actually down among over the entire implementation period as of December 2020. 2023. And since then, we haven't had that many additional announcements regarding QT. So I don't expect those numbers to be updated too much. But I think this is where Haonan and Ji and Colossus work are going to be more relevant. It requires a different approach to tracking down the cumulative implementation effects, given the announcements of a program are very front-loaded, right? And then you have like a long implementation period. So by looking at announcements isn't going to be sufficient to capture the overall effects.
Okay, thank you. Any other questions from the floor?
Yeah, can I ask a question?
Yes.
Yes.
Hi, thank you for spending some of your Black Friday with us. Awesome paper. Thank you. I note that you cite this Smith-Valcárcel for QT1 a number of times on your paper. I wanted to bring to your attention that there is also a published paper by Lewin-Valcárcel earlier this year that looked at QT2 in the US. And so, and found that the announcement effects on QT2 were larger than in QT1 on yields. Yeah, and so I'll certainly send you the paper. You correctly point out that reserves basically have moved sideways, but a lot of that sideways movement, I think, happened after SVB. So if you look from the peak, right, in January 22 to about March of 23, it's about a 30% reduction in reserve balances, which is kind of, I mean, it's much higher, right? But it's kind of on par with the 30% reduction in QT1. And so then when you look at QT2, and we're still on QT2 now, then the question is, you get a sense that then reserves balances don't matter here, and everything is on the repo, all the actions on the repo. So that's question number one. And then a quick question number two, because you made this is the first paper that is looking at QT internationally. It's a beautiful paper. And you do mention there is this difference between asset runoff from the US and then active sales in the UK, for example, BOE. And so do you get a sense then that when we have active sales, that the announcement effects might be larger there, in that it may induce more surprises in terms of the actual on announcement, in terms of how much they're selling, versus asset runoff is kind of almost automated, right? Automatic. I know that someone, I think Clarida mentioned a number of years ago that even with an asset runoff, you can still have a stochastic movement. But do you get a sense that the active sale may induce a larger sense of a larger impact on announcement effects than, say, if it's an asset runoff? That's me. Thank you. Beautiful paper. I really enjoyed it. I've been a fan of it.
Two very insightful questions. First, the timing of the reserve declining. I think you could be right. I mean, the earlier part, there was more of a decline in reserves. And then 2023 happened. There seems to be like less reduction in reserve. There could be some rebound. And one thing that we didn't discuss is thinking about money market funds' behavior in terms of whether to park their cash at the Fed versus holding those cash in the form of short-term treasury securities, that like bills. So they're allowed to hold treasuries less than 1 year in remaining maturity. So short-term bills or bonds that are to be matured. So what happened since 2023 is that we had a big debt ceiling debate. So since the suspension of the debt ceiling in the US, the Treasury Department has basically flooded the market with bills. I think the Treasury Department has increased their bill issuance by around $2 trillion. And therefore, like, money market funds ended up holding a lot of bills and also hold less reserves. So I think that's also something in play that might be related to this Treasury pivoting its issuance strategy to the very short term. And therefore, like, if going forward, if we're going to be stuck at another debt ceiling debate again, right, coming up, I think in January 2025, there's not going to be enough bill plenty. Money market funds going to have to demand more reserves, given the overall demand for money market funds is very large. So that would exacerbate the decline of bank reserves in the next calendar year. So in either case, there's going to be trickier funding market condition going forward for the banks. Yeah, and the second one, in terms of active versus passive QT, we do find a little qualitative evidence that the active QT adopters have a larger announcement effects, and especially coming from the UK. and Sweden. So because again, like there are not that many samples, so I didn't really stress much. And there's also, as we discussed a little bit during the presentation, there's more of effects in steepening the slope of the yield curve, whereas the passive adopters have more of a uniform effects across all tenors. So I think it requires more deep diving into the UK data in particular, because UK is particularly fascinating. It started with passive, it was later added the active, and it was always like a very market-driven approach in terms of running its auction. The New Zealand is less interesting because it's sold back to the treasury directly instead of it's like a buyback program, which this country also did together with massively issuing bills. They also conducted the buyback for the long-term bonds. So yeah, I think UK would be a good country to look at if we want to understand the effects of active QT more specifically. And thanks me for pointing to the other QT paper. I'd love to take a look.
Okay, great. I think we are about time, so I would like to take the opportunity to thank you, Wenxin, again for the great presentation. Thank you, Hao Nam, for staying late, and many of us in Asian time also staying late. Happy Thanksgiving, everyone. Yeah.
Okay, thank you so much. Thanks so much. Okay, see you around. Bye.
Bye-bye.